facts, because when the colonizers came to the United States, now known as the United States, Turtle Island, one of the places they landed was the East Coast, and then it spread to the West as they moved throughout the United States. And so those first contact people, it's 1492 for them all over again, not only with all of us experiencing the coronavirus and bringing in the all of the different germs and everything that has taken place, like the influenza, we experienced tuberculosis, and all of those things combined at this time, we're facing this pandemic, but also they have been what's called terminated. And so that's when the federal government takes away your federal recognition. The federal government is saying you are no longer a tribe, even though these people, the Mashpee Wampanoag, have existed on that land and they are Native people. And so the United States government takes away their housing, their education benefits, all of the things that, all the programming, everything that makes them a tribe. And it's a political land grab is what they are doing. And so there's many of tribes that are worried that they're going to be next on that lineup for the Trump administration. So that's kind of a little bit about what's happening in the United States right now. And just to give you a little bit background on the militarization that is also happening along the border and up in Canada here. We were told that there's communities. Okay, so think back a couple months now. The Wet'suwet'en territories, the Secwepemc people in Canada were facing the military, the RCMP were called in. They were trying to stop that pipeline for coming through their traditional territories. Fast forward a month and a half later, and we're facing the pandemic. You no longer hear anything about the Wet'suwet'en, and you don't hear anything about our struggles because all of our tribes and nations were now facing the pandemic. So this momentum that we had created in our movement, right now, it's quieting down. So we're very thankful that these town halls that we're organizing in new and different ways. And so, okay, so the Wet'suwet'en, we're facing the RCMP. Now, that's Royal Mounted Police in Canada. And now, today, we have, because of the pandemic, there's tribes in Canada, First Nations people in Canada on the East Coast in Quebec and Ontario that are asking for military assistance to stop to help them stop people from coming into their communities on their borders. And yet now the military is not there. The military won't come in to help them. And to the north, there's people that live above the tree line. They live in the Arctic. Those isolated communities, they're fly-in only communities. And so a lot of them, they do not have, there's hundreds of tribes in Canada, First Nations people that do not have running potable water. And so when you think about the COVID crisis, what is the government saying? They're saying, wash your hands regularly. That's difficult in our communities when you live in overcrowded conditions, when you live in a place that doesn't have running water or electricity sometimes. And we're seeing that they're bracing for the worst within those communities, and they're shutting down their borders themselves. And some government officials are praising those nations. I live outside of Six Nations Reserve in Canada here, and they have shut down their borders. And so no one can get in unless they have authorization if they're actual band members. But those are the protections that tribes are doing for themselves to isolate their communities, because they don't have hospitals, they don't have the medical ability and capability to, or the healthcare workers to fight the COVID-19. So I want to just mention that much and put us kind of in context where we're at right now in the United States and Canada. On North America, we call her Turtle Island. And we call this our mother, the earth, because she provides for us. And this connection that we're having with her right now, it almost, it is, it's growing. Even with, you know, all of the traffic stopping, we are actually protecting her in a really good way, by staying home and spending this time with our relatives. I wish you all well. I am thankful for this opportunity to ground this call and talk about militarization, colonization, imperialism, neocolonialism. I look forward to hearing all of the stories from across the world. And I say a big yawanko.
Thank you so much, Sayokla. What you offered us right now is incredible grounding. It is incredibly important to think about those issues of colonization, of imperialism. And honestly, your words were not only stirring and inspirational, but they will shape the rest of the conversation that we're going to have this afternoon, and hopefully all of our work moving forward. We're really lucky right now also to have those words be followed by another great freedom fighter, a dear friend, and a brilliant freedom fighter in the U.S. Congress. From your grounding, we're going to transition into opening remarks from Congresswoman Ilhan Omar of the 5th District of Minnesota. She is going to share her recent groundbreaking package of bills that are titled "The Pathway to Peace." It's important legislation. It's important work from someone who, since she's been in the Congress, has fought tirelessly and fearlessly for everybody, but especially the vulnerable. So, Congresswoman Omar, please.
Thank you, Marc. It's really great to be here with you all. I know they're saying we're socially distancing, but truly we're only physically distancing because we are socially connecting every single day. And I want to thank Sayokla for her beautiful remarks and opening, and for allowing us just for a second to remember how grateful we are for Mother Earth, to center the people who are impacted every single day by the choices that are made by corporations and governments that continue to prioritize profits over people and land. And so I'm so thankful to follow her lead in this call. I'm so happy to be here with you all, and I again hope everyone is staying safe and is happy and healthy in this very difficult time. I was just telling my children, you know, it's really alarming for people right now in the United States to find themselves one day moving around and the next day being constrained. But at a young age, I found myself in that situation when my country broke into war. And so I know the anxiety that people are feeling and the confusion that ensues when you no longer can lead a normal life, and what a tragedy it is to not have a quick answer or a quick fix for situations as such. So if this crisis has shown us anything, it's that it really shows us how we are connected through our humanity. This virus, as we know, does not discriminate based on border or immigration status, race, ethnicity, or criminal history. And it shows that decisions that we make here at home have a ripple effect on those around the world. It shows that a foreign policy that is focused on peace and diplomacy rather than militarization is more important than ever. Earlier this year, as Marc alluded to, I introduced the Pathway to Peace, we believe is a pulled package of 7 bills that helps us rethink our approach to foreign policy. It outlines a bold vision for what a progressive foreign policy should look like, one that centers human rights, justice, and peace as the pillars of America's engagement around the world and makes military action a last resort. It takes into account the experiences of the people directly affected by conflict and the long-term consequences of US militarism, acknowledging the damages that were done when we fail to live up to international human rights standards. And it's sincere about our values regardless of short-term political conveniences. So the package has about 7 bills. The first one is called the Stop Arming Human Rights Abusers Act, which imposes a universal human rights and humanitarian condition on security cooperation with the United States. The bill establishes red lines based on international recognition across violations of human rights and international humanitarian law. Once a country crosses those lines, it automatically will trigger a prohibition on security aid of any kind. Arms sales are included in that, and exchanges with US law enforcement. In the midst of this global crisis, this is more important than ever. We're already seeing autocrats concentrate power, and we're seeing oppressive regimes with political prisoners risking the danger of the spread of the virus. The United States should be, and I will say this again, should be leading the way in preventing and punishing this kind of oppression and not arming those autocrats. The bill package also includes the Global Peace Building Act, which authorizes a one-time transfer of $5 billion from the Pentagon to State Department to create a new multilateral global peace building fund. Peace building has proven to be an effective alternative to military intimidation and coercion. Peace building is also low cost compared to military and security sect programs and has demonstrated impact in many areas in which the Pentagon is not equipped to lead overseas. We also prioritize programs that help create an opportunity for young people to be part of peace building. So our Youth Build International Act will replicate the highly successful domestic youth build program. We're adjusting here to home learning, so we've got little ones popping up. It will help disadvantaged youth attain the education and employment skills that they need to achieve economic self-sufficiency. Replicating this program internationally will put vulnerable young people on the path to prosperity and will help them better engage in their communities. This is the kind of partnership the world needs, and it's the kind of partner we should be. As many of you know, when we talk about terrorism and the global terror that continues to grow, when we talk about what they call the youth bulge, or young people eventually in continents like Africa becoming nearly 40% of the world's population, we need to be serious about what it means for us to invest in young people and have them really become the leaders of not just tomorrow, but today. We also have the Global Migration Agreement Act as part of this package, which will instruct the State Department and US Ambassador to the UN to take a lead on building an international agreement on global migration. The bill also establishes a clear framework for what that agreement should include and address. Right now, as we approach all of this migration crises in the world as case-by-case basis, we are really seeing many gaps arise, and we need to look at it as a cohesive problem. And so you think about the Rohingya crisis, the Central American refugee crisis, the Syrian refugee crisis. And although each of them has a distinct characteristic, there are common threats that connect them all. And there are more people who are being forcefully displaced now than any time in human history. I mean, consider that fact. And so we need to make sure that we are creating policies that urgently address this crisis. Already, we're seeing governments use the coronavirus as justification for brutal crackdowns on migration and immigrant populations. Example here in the United States, we are still seeing ICE detaining undocumented immigrants, and it's really atrocious and unconscionable to even think about that still happening. So this is a global problem that needs a global solution, and this bill makes it clear that the United States can begin to regain its leadership by fixing its broken policies here at home. And internationally, the Global Compact on Migration is an important statement of principles, and we should sign onto it and then build onto that. My really centerpiece of this package is the Congressional Oversight of Sanctions Act, which requires Congress to approve sanctions issued under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. At this moment, we're seeing the dire effect of our economic sanctions that we have in place in countries like Iran. I believe we should cancel these and other grotesque sanctions, which punish the civilian population. The way to do that is by centering power back in the hands of Congress where it belongs, just as we do with the AUMFs and emergency powers domestically. We need to restore congressional oversight over sanctions. And finally, I think as leaders in the world, it's going to be really important for us to rectify some UN conventions, so the rights of the children, and make sure that we are joining the Rome Statute, and finally sign on to the Rome Statute and join the International Criminal Courts. The United States really has been a leader on international criminal justice since Nuremberg, and our hostility towards the ICC has always been at odds with our commitment to the rule of law, accountability, and to the principles that no one is above the law. And so it really doesn't make any sense why we continue to state our principles and values, but not follow up with actions and send a strong message by joining the international criminal justice system. Again, I want to thank you all for giving me this opportunity, for helping me fight alongside you in fighting for a world that is more peaceful. It is really a painful time and a really dark time for us, but we are completely really clear on what the deadly consequences are of many of the inequalities that we've seen for decades here in this country and around the world. And I think this crisis and this pandemic is really laying bare many of the social, economic, and environmental injustices that have existed for decades. And we now have an opportunity to not only set the pause button, but to do a restart and go back into being a just nation that is leading a just world. And so I thank all of you for your leadership, for the opportunity, even now as we are in the midst of this pandemic, centering us in what is truly the fight ahead of us. And I look forward to seeing many of these policies enacted and for us to live in a more peaceful world as we pave the way for that. So thank you all.
Thank you, Representative Omar, both for your words today, for giving us such interesting insight into the legislation you've been working so tirelessly for, but also for all of your work on behalf of the vulnerable. Again, you are a truth teller, you are a freedom fighter, and we're very grateful to have you on our side. Another amazing sister who is on our side is Ashley Woodward-Henderson. She is the first Black woman executive director of the Highlander Research and Education Center, which is a catalyst for grassroots organizing and movement building in Appalachia and in the South. It is one of the most important organizations with such a beautiful and deep history, and we give extraordinary respect to that. But also to Ashley, she's actively involved in many movements. She's also a part of the Movement for Black Lives, the Rising Majority, and she sits on the governance council of the Southern Movement Assembly. As you all know, Highlander played really a pivotal role in the formation of this coalition. And Ashley's here to tell us a little bit about those roots. And she's also going to give us some more insight into the work that's happening right now and that will be happening moving forward. Ashley.
Thank you, Mark, and thanks to all of my colleagues and comrades who have been holding down this Zoom town hall so far. It's a blessing and a privilege to be joining what I know is now over 1,000 people on the live stream. So shout out to all of you who've taken time to join us in what is precarious and chaotic days. We're grateful for you. I've got the honor and the privilege to talk a little bit about how we came to this formation, and I can keep it quick. What's real is that the leadership of the Adela Justice Project is what got us to this moment. A lot of their thinking about how we deserve to have the spaciousness in our lives to be able to dream together, to come together across our differences, is what led to a really dope convening at the Highlander Center in 2019 that led to this work. But what was some of the thinking, you might be wondering, of like how we got to this moment? And basically, it was three things. The first thing is that a harm to any of us was a harm to all of us. That if you came for any one of our communities, communities that you'll get introduced to by the really amazing colleagues that'll be expressing what local work they've been holding. If you came for any one of them, that you were coming for me. If you came for people in the South, you were coming for all of us. If you came for working class people, if you came and you weren't taking care of our veterans, you were coming for all of us. So we decided that we were going to be stronger together. The second piece, that we weren't going to let the decisions of people with more power and privilege than us keep us from working together. And so those were two things. A harm to any of us was a harm to all of us, that we're stronger together. And last but certainly not least, that we can't be progressive in a compartmentalized way, right? Either you are progressive on all things or you're not. And so we tried to figure out what it would look like for us to come together and push each other to be progressive on all of our issues, whether it was racial justice or fighting for a world where we all can live in peace, or fighting for workers, or fighting for all sorts of other issues. And so we brought organizations together that typically weren't always in the same meetings and always in the same room at the leadership of the Adela Justice Project. We came together to talk about what would become possible if we work together across the differences that are used to divide and oppress our communities, to dream up this better world, and then to actually come up with the faithful next steps that we could take towards seeing that world come to fruition. We talked about what it would look like if we took resources that are generated from our communities to harm people and use those to reinvest in the building of better communities for all of us, right? And to think about what it would look like if we practice solidarity, and live into the reality of that better world where everybody can thrive, where no one experiences harm. In fact, that's the only way that we'll come to thriving. And so this hope of building a racial justice movement without borders is really to live into that beloved community that we all have always deserved. Yeah, last but certainly not least, we wanted to also make an intentional recommitment through this particular part of the dream, that we build a world where peace is the reality for not just a privileged few, right? But peace is actually a reality that the majority of us get to experience, all of us get to experience, through building a better world. And you'll hear more about how we intend to do that from my other colleagues. I was also asked by the homies to get us a little cultural grounding, and anybody that knows and loves the Highlander Research and Education Center knows that we believe that if you take art and culture and faith and spirit, you will change policy and practices, and we do that through cultural interventions. And so I want to share with you all a song that came to me from a comrade whose name is Wendy O'Neill. Wendy is one of the smartest, most amazing people that I've ever known. And she taught this song to me during a community sing, but she was taught this song by Michaela Harrison, who wrote it. And I'm just gonna say the lyrics, and I think I've got a couple of comrades that are also visible on your screen with me. They're gonna be like the muted singers with me, just to keep us hyped. So I want you to get into a position where you feel ready to sing. Because if we can't sing and breathe together, we definitely not gonna be able to build like any progressive or revolutionary change in the world together, right? I got you. We're gonna slow this thing down. So get in a position where you feel ready to practice social solidarity while physically distancing. And I'm going to tell you the words, and then you're going to repeat the words, and then we're going to sing the words together. So the lyrics go, I am manifesting protection. Your turn. Perfect. There's a force field all around, keeping me safe and whole. I am manifesting protection. There's a love inside that fortifies my soul. Yeah, you see, these comrades were made for this moment. So now I'm gonna sing it, and you're gonna sing it after me. Wherever you are, on mute, you're gonna sing it. You're gonna sing it so your neighbors can hear it. You're gonna sing it so loudly that we literally make that force field, that we literally share that love that will fortify us through this time, right? So you're gonna sing after me. I'll sing a line, and then you'll sing a line. I am manifesting protection. Your turn. Yes. There's a force field all around, keeping me safe and whole. Yes, y'all. I am manifesting protection. Your turn. There's a love inside that fortifies my soul. Yes. Here we go. Now we're going to sing it all together. So just keep in it. If you don't got the words yet or the rhythm yet, it's cool. Spirit will move. You will catch it. So here we go. Y'all ready to sing? Oh man, you got to make me believe it. You ready to sing? All right, here we go. I am manifesting protection. There's a force field all around, keeping me safe and whole. I am manifesting protection. There's a love inside that fortifies my soul. You are manifesting. You are manifesting protection. There's a force field all around you, keeping you safe and whole. You are manifesting protection. There's a love inside that fortifies your soul. We are manifesting. We are manifesting protection. There's a force field all around us, keeping us safe and whole. We are manifesting protection. There's a love inside that fortifies our souls. I am manifesting protection. There's a force field all around, keeping me safe and whole. I am manifesting protection. There's a love inside that fortifies my soul. We love y'all. Peace and blessings.
All right, y'all. I think we are good to go, man. That was good, man. My vocals weren't ready. You know what I mean? Ashley, I thought we was gonna be like humming or something. You know what I mean? I didn't know it was a full song. That song is dope and it's beautiful. And the idea of manifesting protection is so important for all of us, because we have to manifest it. We have to do work on the ground. We have to organize. We have to build. We have to teach. And that's of course what Highlander's been doing since 1932 in the days of the great Miles Horton and others. But today we got to continue to manifest protection, not just for ourselves as individuals, but as a collective. We have to see ourselves as part of a greater whole. And that work is so important. And that coalition has put out a call for videos. They ask people all around the world who have been directly impacted by US militarization, by US foreign policy, to ask them if they had a question for presidential candidates for America, anywhere in the nation, really. And we're so grateful to be able to uplift the voices of folks who've been struggling against the direct impacts of US war, those who've been pushing back against US militarization, both here, but of course abroad. And as Congresswoman Omar talked about, the impact of that stuff all around the world. And many of them shared these statements for the town hall. And it's really important to understand that they shared this stuff at great personal risk. Let's take a look.
Mientras que aquí en la isla los cubanos contribuimos con el aislamiento y la distancia a que el COVID-19 no sea una epidemia en Cuba, y muchos médicos cubanos colaboran en una treintena de países en la lucha contra esta pandemia, el gobierno de Estados Unidos recrudece su política de hostilidad hacia Cuba y Venezuela, dificultando todo tipo de operación financiera y mercantil para traer alimentos a la isla, además de intentar desestimular tan noble y cristiano y evangélico acto de solidaridad de nuestra patria y de sus médicos. Sabemos que Cuba no está sola. Contamos con vuestra solidaridad. Trump, manos fuera de Cuba, abajo el bloqueo.
مرحبا، سامي عدنان من عماد الطائفية في العراق. شنو اللي سوته الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية في العراق بحيث يأثر على حياتي؟ أولا، احتلالها للعراق وتسليم العراق بيد نظام الإسلام السياسي الطائفي الذي تسبب بانتشار الميليشيات وأزمة داعش والاقتتال الطائفي. اثنين، ساهمت بدعم مشاريع النيوليبرالية في العراق مثل الخصخصة وكذلك رفع يد الدولة من مسؤوليتها تجاه المجتمع. ثلاثة، ساهمت في دعم كتابة الدستور العراقي المبني على أساس المحاصصة الطائفي، وبالتالي زرعت لغم في المجتمع في المستقبل انفجر هذا اللغم وتسبب في الاقتتال الطائفي والطائفية والعنصرية في العراق.
Maximilien Gombe, c'est mon nom, directrice exécutive du REIDAC qui couvre 8 pays de l'Afrique centrale. Les États-Unis apportent beaucoup de soutien à nos 8 pays, sauf que nous constatons aussi sur le terrain que malgré tout ce soutien-là, il n'y a rien qui profite aux populations. Il y a toujours des violations des droits humains, en l'occurrence la formation des militaires au Cameroun et le soutien pour l'alternance de la RDC. La question que je vais vous poser, quel est votre rapport dans la protection des défenseurs des droits humains? Quelle est votre valeur ajoutée pour permettre à ce que la société civile puisse être un des acteurs dans tout ce que vous apportez comme soutien? Je vous remercie.
The United States' continuous funding of Israel and the Israeli occupation of Palestine is allowing the Israeli occupation forces to continue their business as usual, even in these times of pandemic. The Israeli occupation authorities continue with their colonial plans. They continue to confiscate Palestinian lands, demolish Palestinian homes, and their forces continue to raid our communities, assault our people, and arrest them. This all happens with the great help and support of the United States funding and foreign policy.
Sayokla, a leader in the non-violent movement for the basic human rights of the indigenous communities of the former United Nations Trust that is now known as Ambazonia. Our people have been subjected to a brutal military campaign by the Cameroon military since 2017. And I am calling from a high security prison in Cameroon where I have been held despite condemnations from the UNHCR and expressions of concern by the US State Department. US military assistance to Cameroon is enabling the war against my people. Has been listed the ninth in the world of emergent mass atrocities. A way to reduce violence in situations like the one in Cameroon is the UN Security Council International Fact-Finding Mission. Chairman Engel has recently written to the U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, urging her to lead an effort for such a fact-finding mission. Will the candidates commit to support Chairman Engel's request? What are they going to do about the escalated installations in Africa, which mostly only sustain despots?
사드를 완전히 뽑아내고 그리고 철거시키는 그것이 바로 한반도의 평화와 번영, 통일로 나아가는 것입니다.
I think I had an audio challenge. All right, I'm going to try that again. It's been amazing to hear directly from folks so often left out of the conversation here in the United States. And we'll be sharing more statements like these at the end of the program. And don't worry, the videos, if you didn't catch it, the videos will be available at the end of the program. We'll send it out to you via email that you registered with. If you didn't register, you can do so via the link that's going to be dropped in the chat right now. Next, we'll move to our first panel discussion, which will be exploring the nature of the crisis at hand and the so-called solutions that are being proposed in the status quo. And we're lucky to have Hyun Lee of the Women Cross the DMZ facilitating this conversation. Hyun is the National Director for Women Cross DMZ and Korea Peace Now. It's a global campaign to end the Korean War, which tragically is in its 70th year this year.
Hi, thank you, Mark. I'm very honored to facilitate the first panel, examining the impact of U.S. militarism on our communities here in the U.S. as well as abroad. I'm going to start by introducing our three fabulous panelists. Manka Danwei is a child of Liberian refugees. She is an organizer at Freedom Inc. in Madison, Wisconsin, which is an organization of Black, Hmong, and Khmer women, youth, and LGBTQI plus folks fighting against the root causes of violence for resilient and healthy communities. And then also Melody McCurtis is an organizer for Metcalf Park Community Bridges, a local grassroots organization on the north side of Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Their community-led investment plan focuses on intergenerational wealth, health and wellness, connectedness, and cultural vibrancy, safety, and civic engagement. And then lastly, we have Hoda Katabi. She is an Iranian-American writer, community organizer, and creative educator based in Chicago. Her creative political fashion work has been featured around the world. She is the host of #BecauseWe'veRead, which is a radical book club, and also the founder of an all-women immigrant and refugee-run apparel manufacturing workers cooperative. And she says she runs on saffron ice cream and colonizer tears. Welcome to our fabulous panelists. You can't hear it on your screens, but people around the country and possibly the world are applauding for you right now. So again, this first panel is on the impact of US militarism on our communities here in the US as well as abroad. So I'm gonna start with Manka and Melody. I'm gonna ask you to talk about what is the impact of US militarism in your community in general? And then what is it in particular in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic?
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Hyun, for having me. Thank you to everyone who organized this town hall. When we talk about what U.S. militarism looks like in Black communities in America and here in Wisconsin, it means that Black communities have no real representation or decision-making power. We pretty much exist for the benefit of the white colonizers. And there's a use of violence and a threat of violence for us to stay in line, which leads to a lot of the things that our people see today, mass incarceration and mass displacement. So for Wisconsin in particular, that violence and threat of violence is carried out by the police. The policing per capita in Madison, for instance, the capital where I work, we don't spend as much money as other cities around Wisconsin, like Milwaukee or other bigger cities in the United States. But when you look at who is actually being policed, who is being arrested, who is being surveilled continuously, it's all of the Black people here in Madison. It's all the Black neighborhoods. I live on Allied Drive. There are police cars around the clock on this one block for a very small number of folks. It looks like mass displacement and incarceration. People are moving here to Madison to chase economic opportunities, and they're being criminalized for surviving poverty. Black people, like what it looks like specifically during COVID-19, is that Black people are not recovering from COVID-19. And that's not because COVID-19 chose Black people or hits us harder biologically. It's due to structural racism. It's due to our access to healthcare. It's due to us being essential workers, right? And it's due to poverty. Even if folks wanted to go to the hospital, we have many reports among our residents here and the folks that we work with saying, I was sent home, or I was waiting in the ER for hours and hours and just decided to go home. So yeah, that's what it looks like here in Madison. And I'm gonna pass it off to Melody to go ahead and talk about what it's looking like in Milwaukee.
Yeah, thank you. Let's go to Melody. I want to ask you to add to what Manka just said. And then also, you know, we saw after 9/11 how the government used that as a crisis. That crisis had an opportunity to consolidate government power in the name of fighting terrorism and national security. So I also want to ask, are you seeing that now, or do you anticipate the government doing the same thing in the name of fighting the pandemic?
Definitely. Thank you, Monka, for that segue to just give a snapshot of what Milwaukee is going through right now, being a hyper-segregated city with a lot of Black and brown folks in the city of Milwaukee who are in constant occupation of the police force because 47% of our budget, our city budget, goes to the police. So when you look at how much money is allocated for health at 2%, and then we look at how the city's north side, which is predominantly Black, all of the COVID-19 cases are primarily on the north side. So when we're talking about COVID-19, I want to bring up the point of value, right? There was no value for Black and brown people before this happened. And this is really shedding light on the disinvestment, the disenfranchisement. And now our folks are left to be on a stay-at-home order without food, a way to get their medication and different things like that. And as a result, what our officials did was say, we're going to arrest people or we're going to ticket people if we see you outside or see you with crowds, even though they know that there might be 10 people living in a one-bedroom apartment. It might be 11. So how can they stay, within the guidelines of this stay-at-home order? So that's what we're dealing with in Milwaukee on the ground as far as that. And they are using this COVID-19 pandemic to instruct more harm and more ways to occupy the Black and brown communities here in Milwaukee with more of a police presence, harm, and trauma.
Thank you. Let's bring Hoda into the conversation as well. So zooming out now to a global perspective, let's talk about U.S. militarism abroad. For Hoda, do you see connections to what Manka and Melody just discussed?
Oh, 100%. And thank you so much for just all of that really, really amazing conversation just leading into this. I think that everything that you said is so important and so deeply connected. I think that what is really important to note is that we have a culture of militarism in the United States that has really just created a false reality in order to justify its own existence and its continuous expansion. So America builds cages, as we all mentioned, and fills it with our people's bodies and calls it justice. But it also bombs Afghanistan and calls it freedom. It also administers violent sanctions on Iran or embargoes Gaza and calls it humanitarian alternatives to war. And also bans our people and militarizes the border and calls it national security. And so we're seeing all of these words being thrown around in securitization and safety. But what is especially notable, and in this particular moment in history with COVID-19, is that this virus has shown us almost overnight that none of this is not only not true, but in fact, it's the opposite that keeps us safe. So over the past few weeks, hundreds of people who were incarcerated were released due to the incredible work of badass organizers around the country. And just 2 months ago, Trump had doubled down on the Muslim ban and expanded it. But now he's begging for people to enter the country on expedited visas. So we see that the US is sort of falling apart in many senses, but that's because these systems of capitalism and militarism are not made to keep us safe. If keeping people in jails made us safe, then why did they agree to release hundreds overnight? If militarized borders keep us safe, then why can we now get expedited visas to come into this country? We're actually
intervene real quick here, ask you to slow down a little bit, because this is being simultaneously interpreted.
Sorry. Yeah, so I think we see we're actually safer when people are released from jail. Right now, if people are still in jail, that actually is going to make the virus spread faster. And so when people are released, it actually keeps us safer. Decarceration keeps us safer. When resources are diverted from making weapons into or maintaining the United States' nuclear weapons and not funded into healthcare, we're unsafe. And so when we see bills like the authorized use of military force or the AUMF, it makes it even more outlandish, because giving a green light to use all necessary and appropriate force to secure the homeland is bullshit. Because where is our safety right now at the hands of the gross incompetence of the Trump regime in containing COVID-19? And it's already cost the lives as of today of over 10,000 people in this country alone. So you want to use all necessary and appropriate force to shoot the virus with your shiny new tank? And so 100%, yes, this is about safety looks like diverting those resources from the military and the military complex to healthcare, those $700 billion spent annually on endless wars, to education and to reparations and to healthcare. But I also want to be very clear, and this may be a little bit of a controversial comment, but I still want to say it because these resources aren't even ours to begin with. This wealth is produced in sweatshops in Ghana and Cambodia and Bangladesh, and it's mined in Burkina Faso. It's stolen from Iraq and Iran. And so this culture of militarism has not only warped our worldviews of what is safe, and it diverts our own funding, our own resources from from healthcare to warfare, but it also has us delusioned as to what is even ours to begin with.
Thank you, Hara. I'm going to go back to Manka. Can you talk about what is this moment of crisis right now? Tell us in terms of how our political and economic system and its neoliberal policies have failed our communities.
Yes. So when we talk about neoliberalism, we're talking about seeming progressive, but still falling in line with the oppressive systems that continue to exploit Black bodies and continue to exploit brown bodies as well, here in America and across the globe, right? So right now, we're seeing policies in Madison like, here's $100,000 fund. You can apply if you need to pay your rent. Here's a $10,000 fund. You can apply if you need healthcare right now, today, maybe if you're like the first 10 callers, right? Those types of policies are failing us. We need to make structural changes. We need to make changes that actually build up life-affirming infrastructure in Madison and Wisconsin, across the country, quite honestly. Curfews don't keep us safe. Increased police presence does not keep us safe. We keep us safe. We keep us safe through the policies, the wellness policies that we put into place as communities, and through continually fighting for policy that actually has continual and lasting effects to every single person that is most impacted, right? So if you're looking at equity here in Madison, we're great at producing reports. We have plenty of reports that tell us that this is the worst place for Black people to live in the United States, right? So you know where the money needs to be going, you know where this infrastructure needs to be built, do it.
Melody, I'm going to ask you to add to that.
Dang, Monkey, you just hitting it all. You gotta say me something. No. But definitely to piggyback off what Monka said, especially right now, everybody's like, call these resources, but if the whole Milwaukee is calling, you're not gonna be able to get access to those resources. So something that we worked on in 2019 was the Liberate MKE campaign, which was to invest $25 million from the police budget into affordable housing, youth jobs, and non-police violence prevention. And we're going to be doing part 2 of that campaign, and COVID-19 is really shedding light on we have to go really big this next round, because it has to be sustainable, and we have to change some things, because there's no way that people should be shut in without their basic needs met as human beings. So yeah.
And Hora, can you talk about the failures of U.S. foreign policy and what you see as the long-term repercussions of how the U.S. is responding to the pandemic right now?
Oh, 100, everything. There has been no success with U.S. foreign policy. I think that what's like the long-term like product of the current response to COVID is also a historic one. The fact that the United States feels like it can solve everything with the police and army, just as was just mentioned right before, like mental health crisis, send over the police. They have like this disease, this virus spreading around the world. They want to deploy the army. So I think the fact that militarism is being reused as a response for everything is deeply, deeply devastating, because then it justifies the use of all these resources. If it's responding to every issue, then it needs more funds to be able to respond to these issues. And it's also policing of our everydays, both domestically and abroad. It's the policing of bodies, particularly bodies of color, to fit capitalism, to fit secularism, and to fit neoliberalism. So it's a way in which it also affects our every single day, and the ways in which we even are allowed to step outside of our homes. And it really is, I think, it also creates, and I'm assuming based on the audience of this town hall, that I also want to mention that it also creates a sense of US exceptionalism in our movements as well. Even more left-leaning groups and spaces also has a sort of militaristic feeling many times. If we look at US militarism and non-strategic allyship, actually work hand in hand to delegitimize and flatten people's movements globally. So when we're not actually taking directives from people on the ground and still feel like we can do a top-down approach to global solidarity and not listen to organizers, that is not only delegitimizing, but it also is reproducing our own savior complexes. And so I think that we see this, for example, with Iran all the time, that we don't feel like there's no other agent that can be problematic or that can do good or bad aside from the United States. So I think that's something that's important for us to recognize, is that we can understand that American imperialism is deeply devastating and militarism is deeply devastating, but also the Iranian regime is corrupt and is repressive, as is many other regimes around the world. And we can understand both of those together and understand that the people in Iran are suffering between a rock and a hard place. And if we're not strategic about our allyship, we can actually worsen those conditions and play into the Iranian regime's own propaganda and its own agendas of militarism. So I think that we have to understand that we do have an obligation as people living in this country to take responsibility for US imperialism, but not at the expense of people's movements on the ground in these countries abroad as well. And so we're being called on by the people of Iran to end sanctions. We're being called on by the people in Gaza to lift the blockade, being called on by the people of Kashmir to stop doing arms deals with India. And so I think that the calls that we are getting is very clear. But if we are not able to decentralize ourselves, even in leftist spaces, we're only recreating US exceptionalism and the culture of militarism. And I know that, like, specifically right now, things are very like dire and scary. And it feels kind of weird saying this, but I think that this moment in particular is actually incredibly optimistic, because this virus is literally teaching us, and we can see this on a global scale, that our health and our lives are deeply interconnected and interdependent on a global scale. So we're not even calling to lift sanctions so Iran has a fighting chance against COVID because it's the right thing to do, but because if Iran cannot contain the virus, Americans will also continue to die here because the virus will spread. But it's also powerful because it means that our struggles are connected, and that's visually that are connected in ways that we haven't been able to push that language before. And I think that it's really powerful because if there's literally any moment in history, in my lifetime, and I'm sure many others' lifetimes, it's going to be this moment that we can actually push back, repeal the AUMF, repeal sanctions on Iran, lift the blockade on Gaza. I think these are really powerful moments that we might not never ever get again. And we can think of this like an incubation period almost, to think of the most wildest and radical ideas of what a world is that we need to survive, and then actually work on building that in solidarity globally, and literally a transnational and intersectional movement that works for everybody.
That's great. Thank you. I see that we have a few minutes left for our panel. So I do want to end with this point about this is a really important opportunity for global solidarity. And I'd like to just go around and ask each panelist to talk maybe 30 seconds on any example of global solidarity that you're seeing right now that is giving us hope, or alternatively, what is your imagination of what global solidarity could look like? And I can start with one concrete example that I saw last week, which is that many South Korean civil society groups are calling on the South Korean government to defy US sanctions on Iran so that they can send test kits to the people of Iran. And I think that that is a very concrete example of global solidarity that is happening right now. And so I would like to just go around and ask folks to talk about that to close out our panel. So maybe starting with Manka, Melody, and then Hoda.
Yeah, I would definitely say one thing that's really inspiring me right now is the Cuban contingent of doctors that are traveling around to help folks to get through this crisis, right, using their expertise. And it's inspiring me, and it's also disappointing that our country will not allow them in to help us. And that's what I want to see more of. I want to see that happening within our country, and once we get things under control, us sending folks out to help people as well.
Melody?
Monka stole my answer.
She always does, huh?
I'm gonna go with that same answer. I had this wrote down and everything.
And Hoda?
Definitely echo that. I think that was a really beautiful example of global solidarity. I think something else that's been really exciting for myself, at least, is seeing a sort of shared global language and almost shared demands. So seeing demands from like global communities being uplifted here and vice versa. And I do feel like a lot of people around the world actually are better at being in solidarity with movements in the United States than vice versa. But I think that we're seeing a lot of language even around closing prisons, the tie between sanctions with Iran, Venezuela, Cuba, and then also the blockade on Gaza. I think there's like a shared language being built globally, and I think that's a beautiful form of solidarity.
Thank you. I'm going to close this out by thanking our fantastic panelists. I really appreciate that on top of being on the front lines of responding to people who are in real crises right now in your own communities, you took the time to share with us what you're seeing on the ground in terms of the impact of US military policies, both globally and locally. I think that this moment of crisis is a clear illustration of why we urgently need to shift course and reprioritize healthcare and human security over warfare and national security. I think the next panel will dig deeper into analyzing the current conditions. So I'm going to hand the program over to Marc. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Hyun. What an incredible panel. It was so insightful. I learned a great deal, as did I'm sure everyone who's watching. And I know some of you are out there submitting questions in the chat. I can see the questions. Please know that we have a tight agenda, hearing from speakers that we have lined up. But what we are doing is sharing those questions, and the speakers will be incorporating the questions that you're asking into their responses, both in the next panel and all the subsequent panels. So please know that your questions are being heard and they will be answered. Next, I want to move to another panel, which will be just as exciting and just as interesting. And this one is focused on building a kind of shared analysis of why things are the way they are. This discussion will be facilitated by Brittany Ramos de Barros, who is the organizing director of About Face, which is Veterans Against the War. It's a grassroots organization made up of all post 9/11 military veterans who are organizing to end wars, many of which are the ones they participated in. Brittany herself is a combat veteran of the U.S. war in Afghanistan, and she made headlines for speaking out against U.S. militarism. Now, a lot of people speak out against U.S. militarism, but Brittany did so while still in uniform. It's pretty impressive. Brittany, we're going to let you take it from here.
Thanks, Mark. It's truly an honor to be able to do the work that I do with About Face Veterans Against the War and be a part of this amazing coalition, and be joined on this panel with the amazing organizers that are here with me, who I would love to introduce you to. One is my partner in crime, who is a Crystal Rain Tubles, who is a Oglala Lakota Northern Cheyenne organizer from Montana, who has been actively involved in resisting the Dakota Access Pipeline. She's currently the director of Voices of the Sacred, an organization dedicated to the empowerment and leadership development of Native youth. And at the heart of Crystal's work are the connections between environmental justice, Indigenous people's rights, anti-militarism, and other connections that I've heard her make so brilliantly. And her identity as a Native American veteran is central to her organizing. And I think we'll get to hear a little bit more about her, kind of what it means to exist with those what feels sometimes like competing identities. And then I'm also joined by the amazing Corey Peterson-Smith, who is the Michael Ratner Middle East Fellow at the Institute for Policy Studies in Washington, D.C. He researches, writes, and speaks about the U.S. so-called war on terror, as well as Israel and the Palestinian freedom struggle. He's interested in the U.S. military power, borders, displacement, Black internationalism, and the fight for a demilitarized, decolonized future. Ooh, so some exciting personalities here. And so, like Mark mentioned, this panel is supposed to be about us talking about, okay, we just heard about all of these harms that are ongoing, right? And we heard about some of the solutions that have, so-called solutions that have been proposed for our security, for our safety, for the freedom, supposedly, of people overseas. And yet we just heard about how those things are not actually serving us. And so that begs the question of, well, if they're not actually working and they're not effective and they're not serving people, then why are things like this? How did it get this way and why is it like this? So the first question that we're kind of opening with is, the US has been at war continuously in a much more direct way since 9/11, going on a couple decades, and it has a long history of war and occupation before that. And there are many reasonings offered for those wars: national security, preserving peace around the world. What do you see as the overarching reasons why the US invades countries and declares wars that we just heard so much about, both here and abroad? And I think we'll go to Crystal first.
Awesome. Thank you, Brittany. My name's Crystal Tubles, my English name, Crystal Tubles. As Brittany said, I'm Oglala Lakota, Northern Cheyenne. First, I think it's important to note that the U.S. has been at war and occupying territory on Turtle Island since the U.S. as a country's inception, right? And so for us to get to the roots of really understanding militarism, we have to look at the birth of America, right? The birth of the United States. And for me, as an Oglala Lakota Northern Cheyenne woman, that conversation always goes back to colonization. Right? So to understand militarism, we have to understand colonization of Turtle Island in the role that the US military at that point, that wasn't even called the US military, played in that. And so I always say the US military was actually formed around Indigenous resistance to colonization, right? So everything from the strategic locations of forts and now bases to US highways where they are located at, to the names of missions, the names of bases, the names of military equipment, all of that is rooted in Indigenous resistance. It's rooted in the military, the enforcement of our genocide and our oppression and our continued oppression, right? And so I think if we're going to talk about militarism, to have a well-rounded analysis of that, and even on into US imperialism, we have to understand what colonization of Turtle Island looked like. Obviously I could go on and on about all the different examples, but I mean, even just looking at the state that we're currently in with COVID-19, right? Smallpox was introduced to Native people and Indigenous peoples through blankets given out by the US military to our peoples. And so right now, this current state that we're in is really scary. And it's very reminiscent, whether it was intentional or not, it's very reminiscent of that time frame for us, of that being introduced intentionally. And in some tribes, wiping out 90% of their population. And so we almost didn't make it through that period. And so this time is definitely a scary period for us as well. Even looking at residential boarding schools, when we were forced away from our lands to be disconnected, the military enforced that. Whenever they couldn't move us all to one place, then the military then tried to keep us all on our reservations and enforce that. And then when they couldn't deal with us in that situation, they kidnapped our children and they put them in residential and boarding schools. And those boarding schools and residential schools were actually modeled off of the military boot camp. And so everything about the oppression and colonization of our people is rooted in militarism. And then that template was then, or that process of colonization was then taken as this like template in this framework to place onto other Indigenous communities, lands, other countries, right? It was placed on them to then access their land, access their resources in the same ways that they did to our land and to our resources. And I know that's a very simplified way of looking at it, but it's actually a very palatable way to understand the way colonization, militarization, and US imperialism are like all connected and all related, and so it's important to really bring it down to that level and understanding and rooting ourselves in Indigenous resistance and understanding that that's where we start. And then from there we have stolen peoples, and we have forced labor, we have mass genocide, all of these things that we can tie together that bring us to this current state that we're in, and these current conversations that we're in. And so for me, it's all about access to resources. It's all about access to land, and it's all about power and all about control. And it's all about understanding how corporatism and corporations are backing all of that, right? Yeah. And they are pushing all of that. But yeah, so just making those connections all the way back to Indigenous resistance into our current state. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Crystal. No, that's a great summary. So we're going to go to you now. I think that's a great place to transition, right? Which is that piece about corporatism. So we've talked about kind of the very like even social roots and understanding of how we got here, but then, like what causes people. I saw a comment in the chat about, are we going to talk about how Black and brown and poor people are recruited into the military? So Corey, if you could tell us a little bit about how that machine works and connects to what Crystal was talking about.
Absolutely. And I couldn't agree with Crystal more. It's very important and right that we are looking at the very obvious failures of the president and various government officials in terms of managing this crisis. But it's really important to look at the histories of the kind that Crystal is describing and the structures and institutions of this country. And I think it's especially useful to look at what structures and systems are working properly right now and which are failing. If we talk about healthcare systems to keep people alive, to take care of people, those are largely failing, not in terms of the individual medical professionals who are sacrificing so much to help people, but the institutions that they work in clearly were unprepared for this crisis. On the other hand, the institutions of militarization and colonization are robust enough to continue throughout the crisis. And so the kind of history that Crystal talked about, it is a living history, and that colonization is ongoing. As our comrade and relative Sayokla, who opened this event, said, the Wampanoag tribe, Mashpee Wampanoag tribe here in Massachusetts, where I am, was on March 27th informed that they would be de-established. March 27th, as the crisis is peaking in New York, in terms of the outbreak, and this healthcare systems are failing, the Department of the Interior is still functional enough to attack this group of Indigenous people. It's also worth looking at the fact that at this, we saw that a hospital ship was sent by the Navy to New York City and another one to Los Angeles to help with the outbreak. 12 days before the hospital ship arrived in New York City, the United States Navy, the same Navy, deployed not one but two aircraft carrier groups to the Arabian Sea to threaten Iran. And so we're looking at decisions that were made before this crisis, systems that were built before this crisis that are far more prepared to kill and conquer than they are to take care of people. And so it's really important that we now interrogate what are the institutions that make up this country, because we need to completely transform the priorities. And frankly, these systems around killing and militarization shouldn't exist at all.
Yeah, thanks, Corey. That's a really good point. And I think that the word I want to highlight that you just said at the end there is priorities, right? That it impacts the priorities of what gets invested in. And so I want to go to Crystal next. Crystal, you and I are both vets. We both are here speaking about these systems and yet participated in this system. And so, I wonder if you want to talk a little bit about like the economics of that and who kind of sets the priorities for us both on an individual level, right? And how we make decisions about the resources we need in this society that we have, and the way that that connects to the ways that our people, right, are kind of in many ways tricked into being told, hey, if you sign up, you're going to be able to serve humanity, you're going to be able to save people, you're going to be able to be a hero, right? And the ways that serves to have priorities that maybe don't actually end up serving us the way that Corey is saying.
Yeah, I think you summed that up really well. I think like the key part that I kind of take from that and want to look at more is, at the Highlander gathering that Ash spoke about in the beginning of this webinar, a colleague and a friend had said the US budget reflects our values as a nation, right? And so where we are investing our money says what our values are. And at this moment, the US military is like the most funded over universal health care, over education, over housing, and so many other needs that we have in this country. That is what we are telling the world is our values. We value killing. We value imperialism. We value access to these lands, access to these resources. And then what that also says is that we value the oppression of Indigenous peoples. We value the oppression of voices that are actually trying to defend the lands and defend people's rights all over the world, not just in the US, but all over the world. And I also think that's kind of the more visible piece as far as the what we value and what we're investing in. But I also think that, as an organizer, what I've seen too is like just looking at the overall corporate profit has rights over the people's rights, right? Like we value that over that. And that is what is driving everything going on right now is corporate profit. And our country enforces it. Just like with organizing with the Dakota Access Pipeline, I was sued for that. And they turned around and they tried to criminalize my First Amendment rights to defend, and even my inherent right as an Indian, as a Native woman, as an Oglala, Lakota, Northern Cheyenne woman to steward the lands. They actually sued me for those rights. And so I think criminalizing organizers and activists that are actually here to defend happens at the cost of that, right? So we're valuing that. Many of which are the same people that are providing the very mutual aid in our communities for COVID-19 currently, right? Like we're the ones that are organizing like that. And we're also the ones that are on the front lines at these different battles. I think also just really quick is just looking at as far as on the home front, looking at the militarization of police and the way police are actually enforcing the rights of these corporations, the very corporations that are pushing the agenda for US imperialism, right? And so we're actually militarizing our police here on our lands to enforce those corporate rights, to enforce corporate profit, or the right for corporate profit. And so it's important to look at that, especially when there's so much going on here and abroad. Dakota Access Pipeline, KXL, Line 3, Mauna Kea, Wet'suwet'en, at the border. And that's just the tip of the iceberg of the different fights that we are all currently engaged in. That's not even going into our relatives abroad, our relatives all over the world. And that's all being driven by corporate greed, really. And that's what's driving the US imperialism. And that's where our values are currently as a country, is we are investing in that currently.
Yeah, thanks, Crystal. Beautifully put. So we have about 4 minutes left for this discussion. So Kuri, I'd love for you to kind of bring us home. Crystal, I think, gave a beautiful articulation of the fact that a lot of these things are happening for profit motive. I know that when I was deployed, we spoke openly about how we would see contractors just all over the place, making so much money. So tell us a little bit about the relationship between those corporations that we're referring to, and how these policy decisions end up being put into place.
Right, absolutely. I mean, it's very clear. I think the big question is, we know that the United States is the wealthiest and most powerful country in the world. And it's worth asking why that is. It's worth asking why, when we think about the energy corporations, for example, in this country, what has it taken for them to become so powerful and so wealthy? And it's not only the kind of colonization of this place, though, again, as Crystal is talking about, it's clearly the pipelines are central to that, especially recently, but actually they have a long history. But also the US's control, and the control of US and Western corporations, energy corporations in particular, of places like the Middle East, which is rich in petroleum. The control of the ways that US corporations are able to access markets around the world. The fact that US products like Coca-Cola are ubiquitous, it's not because Coke tastes good. It's because the US, through violence, has made it so that all around the world is a market for these products and for these corporations. Now, I hope and I believe that in this country, we're watching what's happening in response to the pandemic and seeing, again, profit reign supreme. In Boston, where I live, as we are preparing for more casualties and infections with COVID-19, we still have private hospitals. They are still trying to figure out, how do we maintain profit while dealing with a mass influx of patients? It's past time to question the role of profiteering in healthcare, every aspect of it. And I hope that as we do so, we question the central place that profit plays in everything about the society, not only domestically, but in terms of what it does abroad as well.
Thanks, Kuri. Absolutely. So we're going to hand back to Marc, but I hope that folks really have a chance to think about this and to bring it back to what we talked about on the previous panel, when we used this word that I only learned a few months ago, neoliberalism, right? I think an example of what we're seeing is, we just heard all of these reasons, right? That we're told, oh, okay, when you're a troop, you're told, oh, you're going to help the Afghan people, you're going to, uphold American values. And yet we know that over 507 members of Congress, current Congress, which is one of the more, we had some progressive wins recently, are still accepting significant campaign contributions from those defense contractors, who then in turn, receive billions and billions of dollars, sometimes up to over 90% of their corporate revenue is tax dollars. And so, when we realize that, we see that there's a cycle of legalized profit and legalized corruption that happens, that we refer to as the military industrial complex. And that getting at those roots, both cultural and structural, is what it's going to take for us to move into the society that we're dreaming of, right? That values creation and building instead of destruction and death and violence to try to solve all of our problems. So thank you so much again. It was an honor. And with that, I'll hand it back to Marc.
Whoops, I think everyone can hear me now. Sorry about that. I was saying that this last panel is incredibly exciting, uh, and the idea from the previous panel that uh, America's values, our national values, are best articulated not by what we write on paper, not by what we say on presidential press conferences, but that our values can be reflected in the budget. Our priorities are shown by what we do, and we have to reimagine and really recommit ourselves to a different national and collective agenda. The previous conversation really helped us understand what that means. It helped us understand what that means on a global scale in particular, and how to imagine the relationship between the sort of national pressures that we face and the kind of global structures and movements that are going. This final panel, I think, is just as interesting because we're still thinking about the national and the global. We're thinking about all of these structures and institutions, but we're also thinking very carefully about what communities need to do in order to address the crises and what it will take to get it. This one will be facilitated by Aris Chenault of Justice Before Peace, which is a Black and POC-led anti-imperialist collective, which is designed to challenge the military-industrial complex through story, through ritual, through experimentation. Reese is a freedom fighter and has been a union and community organizer for 16 years. Reese?
Thanks, Marc. I'm really excited for this important conversation as well. Justice for Peace is obsessed with vision, but we also know that vision is really hard. And so I'm excited to have two visionaries on the call with me right now. I'm joined by Barbara Ransby, who is a scholar, author, and longtime political activist who has published multiple award-winning books, including the biography of civil rights activist Ella Baker. Barbara's also the co-founder of the R3 Coalition and Scholars for Social Justice, which are both part of the National Rising Majority Coalition. I'm also joined by Rama Kudami, who is a Syrian-American organizer based in DC. She serves on the board of the Washington Peace Center and is a former member of the National Committee of the War Resisters League. Now today, Rama is representing the War Resisters League War Resisting Air Wars Network. Thank you all for joining us today. I figure I'm just gonna jump right into it and basically just get into these questions in this vision. Now the issues of healthcare access, paid leave, income inequality, they've all come up in a very stark way during this pandemic. And I think starting with Barbara, what sort of country would we see if racial justice was a bedrock of our policy?
You're asking me to dream big. Thank you, Aris, for facilitating this panel. I really am happy to be a part of this conversation. I'm really happy to be on this program with other speakers, and pleased and delighted by the international nature of this conversation, because I think that's really where we have to start. This panel was particularly welcome because it invites us to not only think about what we're against, which is many things right now, but also to think about what we're for. I think we have to think about what we're for in context. And in the context of this pandemic, we've talked about public health, we've talked about the stay-at-home orders, we've talked about the incompetence of the current occupant of the White House and all that, but we really have to think of it in a much more historical way and a much more holistic way, which is to say it's not only a crisis of the coronavirus, but it's a crisis of racial capitalism. It's a crisis of a set of systems that have existed, that have caused suffering, that have been defined by inequality and injustice for generations. And so we've now inherited that. And in more recent times, the previous panel, Brittany invoked the term neoliberalism. We've seen particular types of austerity policies that have taken resources away from our communities. And it's sort of the very logic of racial capitalism that has set us up for this crisis. So in imagining something different, we have to first name the problem. We didn't have a vaccine right away because it's quite frankly not profitable for big pharma to do the kind of foundational research for vaccines for pandemics that happen once in a decade or something like that. And we see the market run amok with private hospitals and
states and FEMA all competing, trying to outbid each other to get life-saving equipment. So we can imagine a world, that is the opposite of all that, is the kind of world that I want to live in, one that has healthcare for everyone, one in which people are put before profit and before corporations, and that we have to really, I think about what King talked about, in one of his last messages, which was talking about militarism, talking about the dangers of militarism and racism. And he also invited us to think about a radical revolution of rethinking of systems. And so I think that's the invitation, that's the provocation. Crises put us in a position of, rethinking a lot of things, right? We rethink our daily schedules, we rethinking, what's most important to us, how we relate to our neighbors and our kids and our friends and our organizations. But we also have to demand a real rethinking at the national level, as well as the state and municipal level about, how resources are allocated, not to police, but, to the services that our people need so badly. So that's the beginning of an answer to that question. It's a very large question, and one that I think our movements need to take up more routinely and do deep dives into, because really that's the test of whether these movements will be sustainable, whether we can imagine a better future, not simply critique the problems of the existing one, which are many.
Right. So I'm told we might be having some technical difficulties in terms of Rama. So I'm going to go ahead and ask a follow-up question right now, and we'll see if we can pull Rama back into the convo. But I
was really eager to hear what Rama had to say.
Me too. I'm hoping she can come back on the line.
Okay.
Vision is really difficult. It's something that we talk a lot about in radical spaces. We try to make little bits of time here and there, 10 and 15 minutes in terms of our conversations, but it's really hard to do visioning. And I know for a lot of the on the ground work, myself appreciating grassroots one-on-one work with folks in my community and you as well. I know that there's often a lot of difficulty in terms of helping folks see past the empire that we live in. And so if you could talk a little bit about that, about how do we help people see past empire, and how can everyday folks help themselves see past empire?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think we do it by not only resistance, but also creating alternatives. And one of the things that I've appreciated, particularly in this generation of activists, is I see those kind of creative energies being brought to the fore. For example, people working in the abolition movement are not just talking about closing prisons and jails, they're also talking about restorative justice, talking about real alternatives. How do we do it differently? How do we handle conflict? How do we mitigate harm? In talking about the corrosive, devastating, extractive logic of racial capitalism, we see the alternative in the co-op movement that is growing quietly in some ways, but in all different kinds of sectors. Solidarity economies offering alternative ways of organizing the exchange of resources. So I think for me, those are two examples. And I think that's really important because we've seen in social movements around the world periods of interregnum, of what other philosophers have called interregnum, which is the old has passed away, but the new's not yet been born. But we want to seed new possibilities in the context of resisting current injustices. So I am uplifted by alternatives that I see. I'm also uplifted by the sort of mutual aid that we see in this period. My partner actually is an ICU doctor, and so many of the healthcare workers, his colleagues, sacrificing sleep, to really save the lives of strangers. And in some ways, our society teaches us to do the opposite, to be selfish. I mean, we see that embodied in our current president, the ultimate narcissism and selfishness. Don't risk anything, hoard everything for yourself. But I think in these moments, we also see the best of people willing to walk into the fire, not because it's going to aggrandize them, but because it's going to help other people. So I think the more we find ways to bring that out and embrace our more generous selves, the more we explore and embrace alternatives, the more sustainable our freedom dreams will be.
Thanks, Barbara. And I'm told that Rama is with us. Hello, Rama. It's good to see you. So I have a question that I was hoping that you could address with me. What could the world look like if the U.S. took the step of demilitarizing our policies outside of our borders and made reparations for the harms the U.S. has caused globally?
Thank you for that question, Reese. Thank you, Barbara. I'm really honored to be on with everyone in this very important moment for us to talk about, what we imagine our future can look like. And I think something we could, really use in this moment is inspiration from all the activism that everyone on this call has been talking about, is themselves engaged with, the organizing, the advocacy that's happening across the globe. And I think the first thing we will be able to accomplish when the US sees itself not as an imperial power, a superpower to control everything, what we will see is how much amazing work is happening across the globe to fix the collective problems we see and having to deal with, whether it is climate change, whether it's demand for environmental justice, indigenous rights, and anti-colonial struggles, anti-imperialist struggles, the demand for anti-dictatorships. All of that is hard when the United States, and not only the United States, but definitely the United States sees itself as a superpower that needs to control everything. And I think it's very important that we don't fall into that mindset either. The fact that, I think Huda earlier talked about US exceptionalism, and I want to take that concept a little further in terms of thinking about US exceptionalism as a way to assume that we are the ones needing to help people survive. We need to save everyone from the United States, when in fact, people are across the globe are resisting, people across the globe are doing direct action, people across the globe are agents of their own future. And we need to learn from them, and we need to build with them. We need to learn across struggles. We need to build across struggles, but also across borders. Last month marked 9 years, for example, since the start of the revolution in Syria, which was part and parcel of revolutions across the region, from Tunisia to Libya to Egypt to Bahrain to Yemen to Iraq, all rose up and demanded the fall of their regimes. And yet today, we don't remember and we don't talk much about the beautifulness of what happened in that region. We talk, the singing, the chanting, the protests, people creating organizing networks, people creating mutual aid networks, people launching radio stations, people creating artwork and music to capture and inspire others to join, the local councils that popped up in order to discuss protest plans and start imagining the future of their country. What we instead talk about is the war, which is important. We talk, the air wars that happened, the imperial powers that stepped in to crush these protesters, whether it was the United States or Russia or Saudi Arabia or Iran or Turkey. And yet, what happens when we focus in on only the horribleness of war and blood and air wars and bombings is we forget that people every single day are resisting and surviving, and we need to honor that. And the way to honor that is to step back and learn from people out there, people who have been struggling for centuries. Just like we here talk about the need to learn from indigenous struggles, the need to learn from Black struggles, there are struggles across the globe that have been building for so long, and so much to learn from them. And this is particularly true when we talk about the need to resist air wars, which is this network that World Resistors League is working on, is the idea that it's not good enough to just highlight the destruction and to bring attention to that. We also need to talk about the way people have agency in resisting these air wars, and talk about the need to finally dismantle the war on terror. And the only way to do that is really to take the lead of those who are impacted day in and day out, and follow them as agents of change for their own future.
Thanks for that, Rama. And so I'll ask you the same question that I asked Barbara, framing it by saying that you and I have both actually had conversations before about the difficulties of talking about things that happen in places that Americans often view as over there, in reference to what they can do. And I want, especially as we move into conversations about commitment to doing something about what we've heard today, what can help people see past the empire that they live in?
I think sometimes we overanalyze and overcomplicate the simplicity of what solidarity can and should be. So yes, in certain places it's very clear. So for example, the United States sends Israel every single year $3.8 billion in military weapons, in military funding. That is funding that we can obviously use instead for education, for housing, for hospitals, for everything we need for our communities to thrive. And so there's a very material way that we can make an impact to change the lives and create space for Palestinians to continue in their struggle for freedom, justice, and equality. But for other struggles where there isn't that direct link, and there, rarely is there not that direct link, but where, somewhere we're in Syria, as they say, a little bit more complicated for some to grasp, a lot of times it's as simple as recognizing that people have a right to resist their regimes. It's as simple as people understanding that the demands for liberation, the demands for being able to live free, the demands for being able to, just go and live your life as you please, is not something that is just limited based on whether or not the regime these people are fighting against is on what side of the United States, friends aisle they are. And I think there's beauty in being able to understand that literally, if you just pick up a book and start reading a book, that is an act of solidarity. If you hold up a sign that says, "I stand in solidarity with your struggle," that is an act of solidarity. If you hear someone denying war crimes and you say, "No, you cannot deny war crimes," that in of itself is an act of solidarity. So I think what I would urge people is to rethink what it means to be in solidarity. It doesn't have to be complicated and we have to put out a whole campaign and we have to step by step what the planning is and we have to find the exact direct link. People, every single day, people across the globe are resisting. And unfortunately, every single day, people lose their lives in that resistance and through war. And simply acknowledging it is one step that we can all collectively take to say, your struggle is worth it, and we're going to figure out how I, in my little world as a teacher, as an educator, as an artist, as an activist, can acknowledge it in one way or another.
Rama, thanks so much for making it clear for me. Barbara, thanks for your words as well. This was a really powerful discussion, and I feel like I'm walking out of this with a clear vision of what it's going to take to move forward. Thanks so much, y'all.
Thanks.
Absolutely. I also feel like I walked away with a clearer vision and really an inspiring one. We're almost at the end of our time together. And so now we want to shift to a call to action, which will be led by Munira Alimir, a student organizer from Dissenters, a new youth-led anti-war movement doing amazing organizing work all around the country. We'll also be joined by Kitizia Estava, an organizer with Causa Justa, making the connections between migrant rights, housing advocacy, anti-militarist struggle. And a lot of this is happening in the Bay Area, but also around the world. I want to make that toss right now so you guys can talk about the call to action.
Thanks, Mark. So I'm Munira Lemire, and I'm a student organizer at Stanford. I'm a double major in anthropology and urban studies. I study displacement and state violence because I want to understand the circumstances that have shaped my life. I'm a first-gen Somali American, and I'm a Black Muslim woman. American imperialism, war, surveillance, and state violence have always been intimate parts of my life. And my parents are refugees who left Somalia in the 90s to escape from the civil war. So I've lived my entire life in the shadow of war, in the shadow of like 9/11 and the war on terror. And people who are just 1 year younger than me have not been alive in a world without this war. So young people are the ones who are experiencing and will continue to experience the worst impacts of the war on our lives, on our communities, on our environments in the world. And young people need to be the ones who are leading this movement. So that's why I'm repping Dissenters today. Dissenters is a new org that just launched back in January and is a youth-led movement to bring a new generation of young people to reclaim our resources from the war industry and war profiteers, reinvest into life-affirming services. That's Medicare for all, housing, jobs, education, and so much more. Repair the relationships we have with each other and with the planet, and finally turn a tide against endless war. Townhall has been really cool because it's given me and like everyone here a look at what militarism really is. It looks like a war as old as I am. It looks like sprawling military bases across the globe. It looks like violence on our borders, in our jails, prisons, and detention centers, and on our streets. And it also looks like a devastating US sanction strangling our family and friends in Iran in the midst of a global pandemic. Right now, our people are scared, and they have every reason to be. COVID-19 continues to take a terrible toll on our communities, and especially on those that are the most heavily impacted by environmental racism and poverty. And while this is most certainly a time of fear, a time that's shining a bright light on the problems our country was built on, it's also, am I talking really fast?
Yeah, I was just going to say, only because of the interpreters, if you could just slow down a little bit, just to make sure everyone can hear you, because this is great stuff, and we want to make sure everybody gets it.
But like, as I was saying, COVID-19 is really taking a huge impact on our communities, especially on those that are most heavily impacted by environmental racism and poverty. And while this is most certainly a time of fear, and like a time that's shining a really bright light on everything that makes the US the place it is, it's also this time of a lot of hope because it's revealing how intimately connected we are. And most people are realizing that militarism does not keep us safe. And it comes at the expense of the crucial services we need right now in this moment. And people all over the country and all over the world are organizing, striking, and resisting. So what better time is it than right now to build power, to disempower warmongering elites, and demand reinvestment into our health, our lives, and our communities. Dissenters, along with a broad coalition of anti-war and anti-militarist organizations from all over the world, has come together to build a movement powerful enough to turn the tide against endless war and reinvest in what keeps our communities actually safe. So the first major step is to take our power back. There's a crucial law that has stripped our voices, disempowered our movements and democracy, and that's where we're starting, a campaign to end the authorization for the use of military force, also known as AUMF. Politicians supported by corporate elites passed the AUMF in a time of uncertainty and disruption. After 9/11, in a moment of fear, Congress passed the AUMF, effectively giving the president a blank check to wage endless global war without any forms of accountability. And since the passage of 2001 and 2002 AUMFs, U.S. counterterrorism operations from post 9/11 wars as a whole have expanded to 80 countries around the world, costing an estimated $5.9 trillion. The 2002 AUMF laid down the judicial groundwork for the disastrous invasion and occupation of Iraq and is being exploited to help provide false cover for Trump's march to war with Iran. And as a result, hundreds of thousands of people who have been killed, injured, surveilled with Black, Brown, and Muslim communities, people like me, people like you, our communities are disproportionately impacted. And that is why our coalition, Racial Justice Has No Borders, wants you to join our campaign, to put pressure on decision makers, all these people in power, or these corporate elites, these politicians in DC, to immediately end the AUMFs that have been the pillar of escalated US military intervention under the War on Terror. This is one piece of a larger ecosystem of communities and grassroots organizations that are rising up against militarism, especially in the midst of a pandemic. That said, I know, and we all know, that like we need to be pushing against militarism on all fronts. Ending the AUMF is only one step to ending the global war and ending like the U.S. militarism and imperialism. So I'm going to pass it on to Kitsia, who's going to talk more about various efforts. She's a community organizer working on the front lines to release people from jails and immigrant detentions.
Hi, everyone. Can people see me? Yes, great. Hi, my name is Kitsia Esteva. I work at Causa Justa Just Cause, which is a member of the Grassroots Global Justice Alliance. We also want to uplift the critical anti-militarism efforts being pushed at the local, state, national, and international levels. We must support to close the camps, to end immigration detention, and an end to all immigration arrests. As an immigrant rights organizer, I've been seeing firsthand how the part of the military complex of this country is how it targets our immigrant communities who are seeing a double punishment of
having to migrate and be forced to migrate from their homelands and now are here. Many Central American community members are withering away in detention centers, and we have seen already a health crisis in detention and concentration camps that we have here in the US. This is not a moment to throw anyone under the bus, but to actually push for, to end this crisis in detention centers, to push for ICE to stop targeting our communities in our neighborhoods. We want to really uplift the work that immigrant communities have doing on the ground to push against the US intervention abroad, but as well as how we're being targeted here inside the US. I'm also part of organizing efforts to release our families from prisons and jails. We know across the US right now there's active organizing happening that tell us that hundreds local and national organizations are calling to release thousands of people held in prisons and jails who face particular vulnerabilities in the face of this pandemic, particularly people who have heightened vulnerability to COVID-19 because they're elderly, pregnant, people with illnesses, people who otherwise have compromised immune systems. At the local level, from California to Texas to Florida, South Carolina, New York, we are seeing pressure and actions taken that have already advanced the release of many people. It's a good start, but we want to release everyone because we know right now jails are not hospitable. They're not safe for anyone. The jails and detention centers have never been hospitable for anyone. But in this political moment, we really need to recognize that the prison industrial complex is not a place where we want to see anyone in our community. And therefore, we need to push harder and farther to release everyone who is in jail. To see a more complete list of demands, the Movement for Black Lives Matters has a platform that you can look at. We also want to end the sanctions now. Some of the speakers earlier, like Hoda, were talking right about the importance of supporting movements in the ground across the globe that are pushing against US sanctions. We do live inside an empire, and we can do things right now to push against how the US empire is really restricting and criminalizing and really putting other countries in more of an economic crisis. We joined the international call for the US to immediately end the unjust sanctions against Iran, North Korea, Venezuela, Cuba, and the more than 30 other countries and territories currently under US sanctions. And finally, this has been said across all of the panelists, right? The importance of divesting from nuclear weapons, divesting from the military industrial complex that is paid for by our taxes, divesting from the ways in which CEOs and corporations take advantage of our needs and actually take over resources that need to be put back in our hands, in the community's hands, to really push for life-affirming structures that we need. This is another moment in which we want to make sure that our movements are building for a people's bailout and the Green New Deal. We know that we can move money away from tanks and banks into a regenerative economy that centers life, that centers all of us, that centers the work that we need to do to build an economy for the people and the planet. So thank you very much for all the work that you're doing at the local level, at the national level, to push against militarism and criminalization and to build the solutions that we want to see for our communities. We hope that you continue to support these campaigns, learn about the organizations, and join our efforts. You'll get some follow-up information about events and details on how to continue to support this critical work. Thanks, and I'll pass it back to Marc.
Thank you so much, Kitty and Munira, for that call to action. It was informative, but also energizing. It's exactly what we need to be doing right now. Sadly, everybody, we have come to the end of our time together, but we know that this is just the beginning of what we hope to be doing and what we imagine to be a long-term commitment to building momentum toward the world that we need and the world that we want to see. We're honored to end our program with some powerful poems from the Poetry Foundation's Young People's Poet Laureate, Naomi Shihab Nye. When she finishes, we'll go directly into screening more statements from our friends overseas. So I'm going to say my farewell now. Thank you all so much for inviting me. It was an honor to be a part of this. I look forward to building and struggling and organizing and teaching and learning with all of you. Peace. We still rocking. Y'all still okay? So I think we have a technical snafu. So we have a couple of options here. I could read my own poems, which I'm happy to do. I'm a terrible poet, so that might not work out. I could sing, but I'm not really good at that either. So instead, we're going to just wait just a moment while while the wonderfully gifted, powerful youth poet gets ready. But until then, let's talk about, make sure you continue to write down questions, make sure you continue to have your ideas. Make sure if you haven't registered your email that you do so that you can get updates and also so that you can get all the information that was sent or that will be sent to people who registered. I think we also have a pledge and we want to make sure. Yeah. Oh, actually, Kitty, you can jump on in.
Yes, thank you, Marc. We forgot to mention that we want everyone to sign a petition to join our efforts, specifically the work that Munira was sharing, right, about ending the use of military force and the ways in which this gives the U.S. government a blanket capacity to use military force inside and outside the U.S. In a moment like this, it's very, very dangerous for us to have this still as a law, and we want to undo it. So we want to make sure that folks know there's a way to take action immediately by signing the petition, and of course, stay tuned for more organizing we'll do to push to end this legislation.
Absolutely. So everyone, make sure you sign that pledge. This is of critical importance. We can't stop imperialism. We can't stop global militarism if we're not actively engaged in resistance efforts. And this pledge is an important start. It's not the only thing we do, but it's certainly an important and necessary start to the movement that we're trying to build into the world that we want to continue to build. Many people who you've seen today, many of the conversations that you've heard today, are from people who are long distance runners, folk who have been organizing and working since their teens or since college. Some people have been doing it for decades. Some have been doing it for as long as they've been able to. And that's important work. But what's equally important is that everyone who's watching this feel ready and capable of joining the fight. Don't feel intimidated by the language. The language comes. Don't be intimidated by the number of years that people have been doing it. Everybody started with a day one. Don't be afraid to join the fight. When we fight, we win. And we don't win unless we fight. So we're going to continue to build, we're going to continue to organize, and we're going to continue to have joy. And one of the ways that we have joy is through poetry. And I believe, yes, the world-renowned poet is ready. Let's go.
Thank you all so much. Hearing you speak today with such clarity and humanity has restored my own sense of agency and sanity. Thank you very, very much. Am I working? Am I there? Okay, good. I'd like to share two simple poems with you. Thank you for inviting poetry into this session. As a Palestinian American, I dedicate these to all people who struggle with oppression and injustice. During a war, best wishes to you and yours, he closes the letter. For a moment, I can't fold it up again. Where does yours end? Dark eyes pleading, what could we have done differently? Your family,
your community, circle of earth, we did not want, we tried to stop, we were not heard by dark eyes who are dying now. How easily they would have welcomed us in for coffee, serving it in a simple room with a radiant rug. Your friends and mine. And this poem called Cross the Sea comes after a chat with young teens in a reading and writing club in Gaza. A girl in Gaza speaks into a table microphone. Do you believe in infinity? If so, what does it look like to you? Not like a wall, not like a soldier with a gun, not like a ruined house bombed out of being, not like concrete wreckage of a school's good hope, a clinic's best dream. In fact, not like anything imposed upon you and your family thus far in your precious 13 years. My infinity would be the never-ending light we all deserve, every road opening up in front of you. Soberly, she nods her head. In our time, voices cross the sea easily, but sense is still difficult to come by. Next girl's question. Were you ever shy? My beautiful friends today, thank you for not being shy.
Hello, my name is Roberto Zapata and I am from El Salvador in Central America. I work for AMATE, a civil society organization that promotes human rights for all, especially the LGBTQ community. One of the main concerns for organizations like the one I work in is that U.S. economic cooperation has for long been used to impose an agenda that prioritizes the interest of multinational corporations, militarism, and U.S. geopolitical affairs at the expense of the self-determination right of our people. In the past, this has got to the point of plain rivalry. What are you going to do about it?
Amadou, ici à Mopti, et je suis de l'Afrique de l'Ouest, à 700 km de Bamako, de capitale. Avant la guerre, il y avait beaucoup de projets américains qui aidaient les populations pour travailler et de les aider aussi, de leur donner des fourrages, de l'eau et de les contribuer sur la vie quotidienne. Et le moment que les guerres ils ont commencé, et tout le monde ils étaient partis.